I'm Amber Thompson, 23 years old, and I thought I understood how violent my father could become when defending my sister Madison. That Saturday morning proved me wrong in the most brutal way possible. Dad grabbed me by my hair and dragged me across our concrete driveway because my 10-year-old Honda was allegedly blocking Madison's brand new BMW, then kicked me so hard I landed in the garbage cans while neighbors watched in horror. The physical assault was captured on our security cameras, but what I did with that footage would destroy his reputation and finally expose the monster he'd hidden behind his community leader facade. Have you ever been physically assaulted by family members who thought their golden child's convenience justified violence against you? Drop your thoughts about family abuse and favoritism in the comments below, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe, because this family violence story has legal consequences that will leave you cheering for justice. The physical violence hadn't started that Saturday morning, it had been escalating for years as Dad's protection of Madison became increasingly aggressive and dangerous. While I was the responsible daughter, who worked full-time and contributed to household expenses, Madison was the precious princess, whose every want required immediate family mobilization, regardless of cost or consequences to everyone else. Dad's favoritism toward Madison had always been extreme, but it had evolved from emotional manipulation into physical intimidation whenever anyone questioned her behavior or failed to accommodate her demands with sufficient enthusiasm. I'd learned to avoid family conflicts by staying out of Madison's way and minimizing my presence in shared spaces. But even careful avoidance couldn't prevent confrontations when Madison decided she was being treated unfairly. The family dynamic had crystallized around Madison as the center of attention and resources, while I was relegated to background support whose primary function was earning money to subsidize Madison's lifestyle and staying invisible when her emotional needs required Dad's complete focus and protection. My job as a medical technician at the local hospital provided steady income that helped cover household expenses, Madison's car payments, and the designer clothing she required to maintain her social image. But my financial contributions were treated as expected obligations rather than appreciated sacrifices, while Madison's part-time retail job was praised as impressive work ethic despite contributing almost nothing to family finances. The housing situation had become particularly problematic as Madison's demands for space and privacy expanded while my needs were consistently minimized or ignored entirely. Madison had claimed the master bedroom when she turned 18, forcing our parents to move to the smaller guest room, while I was relegated to the basement with its concrete floors and minimal heating. Madison needs the larger room for her wardrobe and social activities, Dad had explained when I'd questioned the room assignments. You're practical and low maintenance, so the basement works fine for your needs. The characterization of my displacement to substandard living conditions as personality compatibility rather than systematic favoritism was typical of how Dad justified every accommodation Madison received at my expense. But the most dangerous aspect of Dad's protection of Madison was his increasing willingness to use physical force against anyone who challenged her demands or failed to provide immediate compliance with her expectations. Family disagreements that should have been resolved through conversation became opportunities for Dad to demonstrate his loyalty to Madison through intimidation and violence. The pattern had escalated over the past year, as Madison's sense of entitlement grew and Dad's responses to perceived threats to her comfort became more aggressive. When I'd asked Madison to help with household cleaning, Dad had shoved me against the kitchen counter and told me to stop bullying his daughter with unreasonable demands. When I'd requested that Madison contribute more money to shared grocery expenses, Dad had grabbed my wrist so tightly it left bruises and lectured me about being selfish with family members who were doing their best to contribute to household harmony. The physical intimidation was always framed as protection of Madison rather than assault against me, creating a narrative where Dad's violence was justified by my supposed mistreatment of his precious daughter rather than acknowledged as criminal behavior against his other daughter. Madison's role in escalating these confrontations was systematic and calculating, using emotional manipulation and victimization narratives to trigger Dad's protective violence whenever she wanted me punished for failing to accommodate her demands with sufficient enthusiasm. "Dad, Amber is being mean to me again," Madison would report after any interaction where I'd failed to provide immediate compliance with her requests. "She doesn't care about my feelings or my needs, and she makes me feel unwelcome in my own home." The characterization of my boundary setting as emotional abuse was designed to trigger Dad's violent intervention while allowing Madison to maintain her image as an innocent victim who needed protection from her cruel sister. The car situation had been building toward confrontation for months, as Madison's BMW required premium parking considerations, while my older Honda was treated as expendable and inconvenient. The driveway hierarchy reflected family priorities, with Madison's car receiving prime positioning while mine was relegated to street parking or awkward angles that served Madison's convenience. Madison's car is newer and more expensive, so it deserves better protection from weather and potential damage, Dad had explained when establishing parking priorities that always favored Madison regardless of practical considerations or fairness. But parking arrangements were just one aspect of how every shared family resource was allocated according to Madison's preferences and emotional needs rather than practical considerations, or equal treatment of both daughters. The morning of the assault had started with Madison complaining that she couldn't access her car easily because my Honda was positioned in a way that required her to back out carefully rather than driving straight forward. The positioning wasn't actually blocking her car, it simply required more attention during her exit than Madison felt she should have to provide. "Dad, Amber's car is blocking mine again," Madison had announced during breakfast, her voice carrying the whining tone she used when preparing to manipulate Dad into taking action against me. "I'm going to be late for my hair appointment because she's too selfish to park considerately." The suggestion that my legal parking in our shared driveway was selfish inconsideration was typical of how Madison reframed normal family coordination as personal attacks that required Dad's intervention and punishment. Dad's immediate response was anger directed at me rather than investigation of the actual parking situation or consideration of compromise solutions that would accommodate both daughters' needs. "Amber, get out there and move your car right now," Dad had commanded, his voice carrying the dangerous tone that indicated he was prepared to escalate to physical force if I didn't provide immediate compliance with Madison's demands. The expectation that I would drop my breakfast and rearrange my schedule to accommodate Madison's hair appointment was typical of how family logistics were managed according to her priorities, while my needs and preferences were treated as irrelevant obstacles to her convenience. But that morning, I made the mistake of suggesting that Madison could simply back out carefully like any competent driver, rather than requiring me to rearrange my car to accommodate her limited driving skills and entitled expectations. "Dad, Madison can back out of the driveway without me moving my car," I'd said reasonably. "There's plenty of space if she's careful." The suggestion that Madison should exercise normal driving competence rather than expecting special accommodations was apparently the final provocation that triggered Dad's decision to use violence as punishment for my failure to prioritize his precious daughter's convenience over basic fairness and practical considerations. The escalation from verbal argument to physical violence was swift and terrifying, transforming a routine family disagreement about parking into criminal assault that would be captured on our security cameras for legal evidence. Dad's face transformed from parental irritation to dangerous rage as he processed my suggestion that Madison should accommodate normal parking situations rather than expecting immediate rearrangement of my car. "Don't you dare tell Madison what she should do," Dad snarled, rising from the breakfast table with the predatory movement of someone preparing for violence. "You're going to move that car right now, or I'm going to move it for you." The threat was clear and immediate, but I was still unprepared for the physical assault that followed when I didn't immediately comply with his demand for instant accommodation of Madison's preferences over practical considerations. "Dad, I'm not finished eating breakfast," I said, hoping to delay the confrontation and possibly find a compromise that wouldn't require me to abandon my meal to serve Madison's hair appointment schedule. I can move my car after I finish. The reasonable request for a few minutes to complete breakfast was apparently too much defiance for Dad to tolerate when his precious daughter had expressed displeasure with family parking arrangements. "You'll move it now, or I'll drag you out there and move it myself," Dad threatened, his voice carrying the dangerous promise of violence that I'd learned to recognize as genuine rather than empty intimidation. Madison's reaction to the escalating confrontation was satisfied anticipation rather than concern about family violence, revealing how she'd learned to use Dad's protective aggression as a weapon against family members who failed to prioritize her needs and preferences. "Dad, don't let her disrespect you," Madison said, her voice carrying encouragement for violent intervention rather than requests for peaceful resolution. "She never listens unless you make her listen." The suggestion that reasonable parking discussions constituted disrespect requiring forceful correction was typical of how Madison manipulated Dad's protective instincts to justify violence against anyone who questioned her demands or failed to provide immediate compliance. When I remained seated at the breakfast table instead of immediately abandoning my meal to serve Madison's convenience, Dad's threats became action with terrifying speed and brutality. He grabbed my hair with both hands, yanking me up from the chair with force that sent shooting pain through my scalp and neck. The breakfast bowl crashed to the floor as I was pulled away from the table, but Dad's focus was entirely on punishing my defiance rather than considering the consequences of his violence. "You want to be stubborn about this?" Dad growled as he dragged me toward the front door by my hair. "Let's go move your car right now." The physical dragging was excruciating and humiliating, with concrete steps scraping against my bare feet, and neighbors beginning to notice the commotion, as Dad hauled me across our driveway like I was garbage rather than his daughter. The security cameras that Dad had installed for home protection were recording every second of his criminal assault, capturing footage that would later provide irrefutable evidence of domestic violence for law enforcement and legal proceedings. "Dad, stop. You're hurting me," I screamed as he continued dragging me across the rough concrete, leaving skin behind on the driveway surface while Madison watched from the doorway with obvious satisfaction about my punishment. But Dad's rage was beyond reasoning or appeals for mercy, focused entirely on demonstrating his willingness to use extreme violence to enforce Madison's demands and punish any family member who questioned her authority or convenience. "You should have moved the car when I told you to," Dad panted as he finally released my hair near my Honda. "Now you're going to learn what happens when you disrespect Madison and ignore my instructions." The suggestion that normal parking discussions constituted disrespect worthy of violent punishment revealed how completely Dad had lost perspective about appropriate responses to routine family coordination issues. But the assault wasn't finished. As I struggled to my feet, trying to process the physical and emotional trauma of being dragged across concrete by my own father, Dad delivered the final blow that would ensure criminal charges and permanent relationship destruction. He kicked me in the back with such force that I flew forward into our garbage cans, landing among the trash with a crash that brought neighbors running to investigate what sounded like a serious accident or attack. "Now move your damn car," Dad commanded as I lay stunned among the scattered garbage, trying to assess whether I'd suffered serious injuries from the kick and fall. The sight of his daughter lying in trash after he'd assaulted her was apparently not enough to trigger any remorse or recognition that he'd crossed every line of acceptable parental behavior and entered criminal territory that would have lasting legal and social consequences. Madison's reaction to seeing her sister kicked into garbage cans was laughter rather than horror, revealing how completely she'd internalized the family dynamic where my suffering was entertainment and Dad's violence was justified protection of her preferences and priorities. "That's what you get for being difficult," Madison said cheerfully, as she stepped over my belongings scattered on the driveway. "Maybe now you'll remember to be more considerate of my needs." The characterization of criminal assault as a lesson in consideration was breathtaking in its cruelty and lack of empathy for the sister who'd just been brutalized for suggesting that normal driving skills could solve parking coordination issues. Neighbors who'd witnessed the assault were calling police and paramedics, recognizing domestic violence when they saw it regardless of Dad's attempts to justify his behavior as appropriate parental discipline for a disrespectful adult daughter. "Sir, you need to step away from her right now," I heard Mr. Davidson from next door command as he approached our driveway with his phone already dialing emergency services. "What you just did is assault, and the police are on their way." The external intervention was both embarrassing and liberating, providing witnesses to Dad's criminal behavior while ensuring that medical attention and legal consequences would follow his decision to use extreme violence against his own daughter over parking arrangements. As I lay among the garbage cans, bleeding from scrapes and trying to assess the damage from Dad's kick, I realized that this assault had crossed every line and would require legal intervention rather than family conflict resolution. The security cameras had recorded everything, neighbors had witnessed the violence, and my physical injuries would provide medical evidence of criminal assault that no amount of family manipulation could explain away or minimize. Dad's decision to kick his daughter into garbage cans over parking preferences had just destroyed his reputation and exposed the domestic violence that had been escalating behind closed doors for years. The sound of sirens arriving at our house within minutes of the assault was both terrifying and validating, confirming that neighbors had recognized the severity of Dad's violence and understood that what they'd witnessed was criminal behavior rather than family discipline. As I struggled to stand up from the scattered garbage, trying to assess my injuries while processing the emotional trauma of being brutalized by my own father, I could hear Dad already preparing his defense strategy. "This is just a family disagreement that got out of hand," Dad told the first responding officer, his voice shifting to the reasonable tone he used in public settings. "My daughter was being disrespectful and defiant, and I was trying to teach her about family responsibility and consideration for her sister." The attempt to characterize criminal assault as parental discipline was typical of Dad's ability to manipulate narratives and minimize his violent behavior when confronted by authorities or community members. But the paramedics who were examining my injuries weren't interested in family dynamics or parenting philosophies. They were documenting physical evidence of domestic violence that would support criminal charges regardless of Dad's justifications. "You have significant abrasions on your feet and legs from being dragged across concrete," the paramedic explained as she cleaned and photographed my injuries. "The bruising on your scalp and neck is consistent with hair pulling, and you're going to need X-rays to determine if there's internal damage from the kick to your back." The medical documentation was thorough and professional, creating an official record of assault injuries that would be admissible in criminal proceedings and civil litigation against Dad for domestic violence. The responding police officers were equally professional and thorough in their investigation, taking statements from witnesses and securing the security camera footage that had captured every moment of Dad's assault from multiple angles. "Mr. Thompson, we have multiple witnesses who saw you drag your daughter across the driveway by her hair and then kick her into the garbage cans," Detective Martinez explained as she reviewed the preliminary evidence. "This is domestic violence assault, and you're under arrest." The arrest was swift and public, with neighbors watching as Dad was handcuffed and placed in the police car, while continuing to insist that his behavior was justified parental discipline rather than criminal violence. Madison's reaction to Dad's arrest was immediate panic about the social and legal consequences, rather than concern about the family violence she'd witnessed and encouraged. "This is all Amber's fault," Madison told the officers, apparently believing that victim blaming would somehow reduce Dad's criminal liability. "She was being difficult and disrespectful, and she made Dad angry by not moving her car when he asked nicely." The suggestion that I had somehow caused my own assault by failing to immediately accommodate Madison's parking preferences was typical of the family manipulation tactics that had normalized Dad's violence for years. But the police officers weren't interested in Madison's victim-blaming narratives or family dynamics that might excuse domestic violence. There's no justification for dragging someone across concrete and kicking them into garbage cans, Officer Rodriguez explained to Madison. Your father committed assault regardless of what preceded the violence. The security camera footage was even more damning than witness testimony, providing crystal clear evidence of Dad's criminal behavior that would be impossible to explain away or minimize during legal proceedings. This footage shows clear evidence of domestic violence assault, Detective Martinez explained, as we reviewed the recording at the police station. Your father's actions constitute multiple criminal charges including aggravated assault and battery. The video evidence captured not only the physical violence, but also Madison's encouragement of Dad's assault and her satisfaction with my suffering, providing documentation of the family dynamics that had enabled and escalated Dad's violent behavior over years of systematic abuse. My decision to pursue full criminal prosecution rather than family mediation was made easier by the medical evidence, witness testimony, and video documentation that made Dad's guilt indisputable and his violence undeniable. I want to press charges and seek the maximum penalties allowed by law, I told Detective Martinez during my formal statement. This wasn't an isolated incident, it's part of a pattern of escalating violence that needs legal intervention to stop. The criminal investigation revealed that neighbors had previously called police about domestic disturbances at our house, but previous incidents had been resolved without arrests or charges because I'd been too intimidated to cooperate with investigations. Ms. Thompson, we have records of multiple domestic disturbance calls to your address over the past 2 years, Detective Martinez informed me. Were there previous incidents of violence that you didn't report? The documentation of previous incidents created a pattern of escalating domestic violence that would support enhanced charges and longer prison sentences for Dad's systematic abuse of his daughter over years of family conflicts. But the most important evidence was my own testimony about the family dynamics that had normalized violence and created conditions where Madison's preferences justified criminal assault against her sister. My father has been using physical intimidation and violence against me for over 2 years, I explained in my formal statement. The violence always escalated when I failed to immediately accommodate my sister's demands or questioned her special treatment in family decisions. The testimony established motive and pattern for Dad's assault, showing that this wasn't isolated anger, but systematic domestic violence designed to enforce family hierarchy and punish challenges to Madison's privileged position. As the criminal case developed and evidence mounted against Dad, I was also consulting with civil attorneys about personal injury litigation that would ensure financial consequences for his violent behavior. Ms. Thompson, you have strong grounds for civil liability claims including assault, battery, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and possibly civil rights violations under domestic violence statutes, the attorney explained during our consultation. The combination of criminal charges and civil litigation would ensure that Dad faced both legal punishment and financial consequences for his decision to use extreme violence against his own daughter over parking arrangements. But the most satisfying aspect of the legal proceedings was that Dad's community reputation as a successful businessman and family man was being destroyed by video evidence of his true character and violent behavior toward family members. The security footage had been released to local media as part of the criminal case, showing the entire community exactly what kind of man they'd been respecting and trusting with business relationships and social interactions. The criminal charges filed against Dad were comprehensive and severe, reflecting the seriousness of domestic violence assault and the strength of evidence captured on security cameras and witnessed by multiple neighbors. The district attorney's office had decided to prosecute the case aggressively, viewing it as an opportunity to demonstrate that domestic violence wouldn't be tolerated regardless of family relationships or social standing. Mr. Thompson is being charged with aggravated assault, battery, unlawful restraint, and domestic violence under enhanced penalty statutes, the prosecutor explained during a press briefing that made our family situation public knowledge throughout the community. The video evidence and witness testimony support the most serious charges available under state domestic violence laws. The enhanced penalties were possible because of Dad's history of domestic disturbance calls and the particularly brutal nature of dragging me across concrete and kicking me into garbage cans while neighbors watched in horror. Each charge carried potential prison time that could total over 10 years if Dad was convicted on all counts, transforming his decision to violently punish my parking preferences into criminal behavior with life-altering legal consequences. The preliminary hearing was attended by local media, who'd obtained copies of the security footage, making Dad's assault a matter of public record and community scandal that destroyed his reputation as a respected businessman and family man. Local business owner arrested for brutal assault on daughter over parking dispute was the headline that appeared in our local newspaper, accompanied by still images from the security video that showed Dad dragging me across the driveway and kicking me into trash cans. The media coverage was devastating to Dad's business relationships and social standing, with clients cancelling contracts and friends distancing themselves from someone whose violent behavior had been documented and broadcast throughout the community. But the criminal prosecution was just the beginning of the legal consequences Dad would face for his decision to use extreme violence against his own daughter. The civil lawsuit I'd filed was seeking damages for medical expenses, pain and suffering, lost wages from missed work due to injuries, and punitive damages designed to punish Dad financially for his criminal behavior. Ms. Thompson, your civil case is extremely strong because of the video evidence and criminal conviction, my attorney explained. Juries are particularly sympathetic to domestic violence victims, especially when the violence is captured on camera and committed by a parent against their own child. The civil litigation discovery process was revealing additional evidence of Dad's violent behavior and Madison's role in encouraging family violence through manipulation and victim-blaming narratives. Text messages between Dad and Madison showed planning and coordination around punishing me for various perceived infractions, including discussions about teaching Amber lessons, about family loyalty, and respect for Madison's needs and preferences. These text messages show premeditation and conspiracy to commit domestic violence, my attorney explained. Your father and sister were coordinating punishment strategies designed to force your compliance through intimidation and assault. The evidence of conspiracy transformed Madison from passive beneficiary of Dad's violence into active participant, who could face her own criminal charges for encouraging and facilitating domestic violence against her sister. My decision to include Madison as a co-defendant in the civil lawsuit was based on her documented role in triggering Dad's assault and her continued support for his violent behavior even after witnessing the brutal results. Madison Thompson encouraged, facilitated, and celebrated domestic violence against her sister, the civil complaint stated. She used emotional manipulation to trigger her father's violent behavior and showed satisfaction with the physical harm inflicted on the plaintiff. The inclusion of Madison in the lawsuit was strategically important because it ensured that both family members who'd participated in the violence would face financial consequences for their behavior. But the most powerful aspect of my legal response was the restraining order that prohibited both Dad and Madison from contacting me or coming within 500 feet of my residence, workplace, or any location where I might be present. Have you ever been so brutally assaulted by family members that legal intervention became the only way to protect yourself from people who saw violence as acceptable conflict resolution? When you realized that their love was actually systematic abuse disguised as family discipline and protection. Share your experiences with domestic violence and family legal battles in the comments below, because what happened next would show exactly why criminal prosecution is sometimes the only response to family violence. The restraining order was comprehensive and enforceable, creating legal barriers that made it impossible for Dad and Madison to continue their patterns of intimidation and violence while I recovered from the assault and trauma they'd inflicted. The court finds clear and convincing evidence of domestic violence and ongoing threat to the petitioner's safety, the judge stated when granting the restraining order. The defendants are prohibited from any direct or indirect contact with the plaintiff pending resolution of criminal and civil proceedings. The legal protection was immediate and powerful, but it was also socially isolating as I navigated community reactions to our family's domestic violence scandal becoming public knowledge through media coverage and legal proceedings. Some community members were supportive and horrified by Dad's behavior, expressing sympathy for what I'd endured and disgust at the violence they'd witnessed through security footage and news reports. "Amber, I'm so sorry this happened to you," Mrs. Patterson from across the street told me when I returned home from the hospital. "No one should be treated that way by their own father, and I'm proud of you for pressing charges instead of accepting that kind of abuse." But other community members were less supportive, apparently believing that family violence should be resolved privately rather than through criminal prosecution that embarrassed successful businessmen and destroyed family relationships. This whole situation could have been handled within the family instead of dragging it through the courts and media, I overheard Mr. Johnson telling neighbors during a conversation about our domestic violence case. The suggestion that criminal assault should be handled as a family matter rather than prosecuted legally was typical of attitudes that enabled and perpetuated domestic violence by treating it as private business rather than criminal behavior. My response to community judgment and family pressure to drop charges was consistent with the boundary setting I'd learned through legal advocacy and domestic violence counseling. Domestic violence is criminal behavior that requires legal consequences, I explained to anyone who suggested family mediation over criminal prosecution. My father committed aggravated assault, and he needs to face the same penalties as any other criminal who uses violence against victims. The strength I'd gained through legal advocacy and community support was transforming my relationship with family conflict and my understanding of appropriate responses to violent behavior disguised as family discipline. 6 months after Dad's arrest for domestic violence assault, the community and legal consequences were continuing to destroy every aspect of his life, while simultaneously validating my decision to pursue criminal prosecution rather than family reconciliation. The security footage of him dragging me across concrete and kicking me into garbage cans had become local media sensation that ended his business career and social standing permanently. Dad's construction company had lost every major contract within weeks of his arrest, with clients citing moral clauses and public relations concerns about associating their projects with someone who'd been filmed brutally assaulting his own daughter over parking preferences. "We can't have our company name associated with domestic violence," explained the spokesperson for our city's largest development firm when announcing the termination of Dad's contracts. The video evidence of Mr. Thompson's behavior toward his daughter is incompatible with our corporate values and community reputation. The financial consequences were swift and comprehensive, forcing Dad to close his business and file for bankruptcy when legal fees from both criminal defense and civil litigation combined with loss of income and punitive damages to create insurmountable debt. But more satisfying than Dad's financial ruin was the social isolation he was experiencing as community members who'd previously respected him learned about his true character through legal proceedings and media coverage. "I never imagined that Richard Thompson was capable of such violence," said Pastor Williams from Dad's church during a local news interview about domestic violence in our community. The man who appeared in public was completely different from the person captured on that security footage. The church community's rejection of Dad after witnessing his violent behavior was particularly meaningful because it represented moral judgment from people whose opinions he'd valued and whose respect he'd cultivated through years of charitable contributions and community involvement. Madison's social consequences were equally severe but differently focused, with friends and classmates learning about her role in triggering and celebrating Dad's assault against me through court testimony and evidence presented during legal proceedings. Madison encouraged her father's violence and showed satisfaction when her sister was brutalized, became public knowledge through court records and media coverage that exposed her manipulation tactics, an entitled attitude toward family violence. Her part-time retail job had been terminated when security footage of the assault was broadcast, with her employer citing concerns about employee character and public relations implications of employing someone who'd celebrated domestic violence against her own sister. But Madison's response to facing consequences for her role in family violence was predictable victim blaming and denial rather than acknowledgement of her participation in criminal behavior. "This is all Amber's fault for pressing charges instead of handling this as a family matter," Madison told anyone who would listen to her version of events. "She destroyed our family because she couldn't take responsibility for being disrespectful to Dad." The continued victim blaming even after witnessing the brutal results of her manipulation was revealing about Madison's complete inability to understand the difference between family disagreements and criminal violence. The criminal trial was scheduled for 8 months after the assault, but Dad's attorney was already negotiating plea agreements to avoid the public testimony and additional media coverage that would result from jury trial proceedings. "Your father is facing overwhelming evidence and wants to accept responsibility through plea agreement rather than forcing you to testify about family violence," the prosecutor explained during our preparation meetings. "He's willing to plead guilty to aggravated assault in exchange for reduced sentence recommendations." The plea offer was tempting because it would avoid traumatic testimony and ensure conviction without trial stress, but it would also allow Dad to minimize his behavior and avoid the most serious charges that reflected the true nature of his violence. "My decision to reject the initial plea offer and demand full prosecution was based on the principle that domestic violence should face maximum legal consequences rather than reduced penalties for family convenience. I want Dad to face the full legal consequences of dragging me across concrete and kicking me into garbage cans," I told the prosecutor. Plea agreements that minimize domestic violence send the wrong message to other victims and perpetrators. The civil lawsuit was proceeding simultaneously with the criminal case, creating financial pressure that complemented the potential prison time Dad was facing for his assault conviction. "Ms. Thompson, your civil damages could exceed $200,000 when we include medical expenses, lost wages, pain and suffering, and punitive damages," my civil attorney explained. "The video evidence makes this an extremely strong case for maximum financial recovery." The combination of criminal conviction and civil judgment would ensure that Dad faced both incarceration and financial ruin for his decision to use extreme violence against his own daughter over family parking preferences. Extended family relationships had undergone dramatic transformation as relatives processed the security footage and court evidence that revealed the true dynamics of our household and Dad's systematic violence disguised as family discipline. Uncle Steve, Dad's brother, called me with a heartfelt apology for years of enabling Dad's behavior and minimizing my concerns about family violence. "Amber, I owe you an apology for not taking your complaints about Richard's behavior more seriously," Uncle Steve said during our conversation. "Seeing that security footage made me realize that what we dismissed as strict parenting was actually criminal abuse." The family support was validating, but also highlighted how many relatives had witnessed concerning behavior over the years without intervening or offering support when I tried to establish boundaries around Dad's violence. But the most meaningful support came from domestic violence advocates and other survivors who reached out after media coverage of my case, sharing their own stories and expressing gratitude for my willingness to prosecute rather than accepting family violence as normal relationship dynamics. "Your courage in pressing charges and speaking publicly about domestic violence helps other victims understand that family relationships don't excuse criminal behavior," wrote one survivor in a letter that was typical of dozens I received from people who'd experienced similar family abuse. The advocacy opportunities that grew from my legal case were transforming personal trauma into community education about domestic violence recognition and legal resources for family abuse victims. My speaking engagements at domestic violence awareness events and legal advocacy workshops were helping other victims understand their rights and options for protecting themselves from family members who used violence as control mechanisms. Family members who commit domestic violence should face the same legal consequences as strangers who assault victims, I explained during one presentation to law enforcement officers. Blood relationships don't create immunity from criminal prosecution for violent behavior. As Dad's trial date approached and media attention continued focusing on our domestic violence case, I was building a new life based on legal boundaries and authentic relationships with people who supported my decision to choose safety over family accommodation. The apartment I'd rented with support from victim assistance programs was the first living space I'd controlled without family manipulation or threats of violence, providing physical and psychological safety that allowed healing from years of systematic abuse. 8 months after Dad dragged me across concrete and kicked me into garbage cans, the criminal trial was reaching its climax with jury deliberation on charges that would determine whether he faced years in prison or reduced sentences through plea bargaining. The courtroom had been packed throughout the proceedings, with community members, domestic violence advocates, and media representatives witnessing testimony that exposed decades of family violence hidden behind Dad's respectable businessman facade. The prosecutors' closing arguments were devastating in their use of security footage, medical evidence, and witness testimony to demonstrate the calculated nature of Dad's assault and its place within systematic domestic violence patterns. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you've seen video evidence of Richard Thompson dragging his daughter across concrete by her hair and kicking her into garbage cans with enough force to cause serious injury, the prosecutor stated while displaying still images from our security cameras. This wasn't parental discipline, this was criminal assault that could have killed or permanently disabled the victim. The medical testimony had been particularly powerful, with emergency room physicians explaining how Dad's kick could have caused internal bleeding or spinal damage if the garbage cans hadn't absorbed some of the impact force. The defendant's assault on his daughter created substantial risk of serious bodily injury or death, Dr. Martinez testified. Ms. Thompson was fortunate that she didn't suffer permanent spinal damage or internal organ rupture from the force of the kick. Madison's testimony, as a prosecution witness, had been devastating to Dad's defense strategy, revealing her role in encouraging violence while exposing the family dynamics that had normalized domestic abuse for years. Madison Thompson admitted under oath that she regularly manipulated her father into using violence against her sister, the prosecutor reminded jurors. She described these incidents as teaching Amber lessons about family loyalty and respect. The defense attorney's attempts to characterize Dad's violence as momentary loss of control were undermined by evidence of planning, previous incidents, and Madison's testimony about systematic patterns of family punishment through physical intimidation. Mr. Thompson's assault on his daughter was premeditated violence designed to enforce family hierarchy through fear and brutality, the prosecutor concluded. This jury must hold him accountable for domestic violence that terrorized his own child for years. The jury deliberation lasted only 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges: aggravated assault, battery, unlawful restraint, and domestic violence with enhanced penalties. The speed of conviction indicated that video evidence and witness testimony had made Dad's guilt indisputable. With the jury find the defendant guilty of aggravated assault in the first degree, the jury foreman announced as Dad sat motionless at the defense table, finally understanding that his violence would have serious legal consequences. The sentencing hearing 2 weeks later was my opportunity to address the court about the impact of Dad's violence and to request maximum penalties for domestic violence that had escalated over years of family conflict. Your Honor, my father's assault wasn't an isolated incident, but the culmination of systematic domestic violence that controlled my behavior through fear and intimidation, I testified during victim impact statements. He used physical force to enforce my sister's demands and punish any challenge to family hierarchy that privileged her needs over my safety. The judge's response was strong and unequivocal in condemning domestic violence while recognizing the courage required for victims to pursue criminal prosecution against family members. Mr. Thompson, "You committed brutal assault against your own daughter over parking arrangements," Judge Rodriguez stated during sentencing. The video evidence shows calculated violence that could have caused permanent injury or death. This court will not tolerate domestic violence regardless of family relationships. The sentence was comprehensive and severe: 4 years in state prison, 5 years supervised probation, mandatory domestic violence counseling, $50,000 in restitution for medical expenses and pain and suffering, and a permanent restraining order prohibiting any contact with me. Mr. Thompson will serve a minimum of 2 years before parole eligibility, Judge Rodriguez explained. The sentence reflects the serious nature of domestic violence and the need to protect victims from family members who use violence as control mechanisms. The criminal conviction was immediately followed by resolution of the civil lawsuit, with Dad's remaining assets being liquidated to pay the $150,000 judgment for assault, battery, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and punitive damages. "Your father's conviction on criminal charges makes the civil liability automatic," my attorney explained as we finalized the settlement. "The judgment will follow him for years and ensure financial consequences that complement his prison sentence." Madison's role as co-defendant in the civil lawsuit resulted in her own financial liability for encouraging and facilitating domestic violence, with judgment requiring her to pay damages from any future earnings or assets. Madison Thompson is jointly liable for damages because of her documented role in triggering and celebrating violence against her sister, the civil judgment stated. Her manipulation tactics and victim blaming constitute intentional infliction of emotional distress. The comprehensive legal victory was satisfying, but also emotionally complex, representing justice for years of family abuse while permanently severing relationships with people who'd shaped my entire life experience. But the most meaningful outcome was the transformation in community attitudes toward domestic violence and family relationships that my case had generated through media coverage and public education. The Thompson case has changed how our community understands domestic violence, explained the director of our local women's shelter during a news interview. Amber's courage in prosecuting her father has encouraged other victims to seek help and legal protection from family abuse. The domestic violence awareness presentations I was giving at schools, churches, and community organizations were helping people recognize warning signs and understand legal options for protecting themselves from family members who used violence as control mechanisms. Family relationships don't create immunity from criminal behavior, I emphasized during these presentations. Domestic violence is a crime regardless of whether it's committed by strangers or relatives who claim to love you. The victim advocacy work that had grown from my legal case was providing purpose and meaning that transformed personal trauma into community education and support for other domestic violence survivors. 2 years after Dad was sentenced to prison for dragging me across concrete and kicking me into garbage cans, I was standing in my new home office, reviewing applications for the domestic violence victim advocacy program I'd established with my civil lawsuit settlement money. The foundation was helping dozens of family abuse survivors navigate legal systems and find resources for escaping violent households that normalized criminal behavior as family discipline. Dad's prison sentence was progressing exactly as the judge had ordered, with his earliest parole possibility still months away and contingent on completing domestic violence counseling that would address the attitudes and behaviors that had led to his assault conviction. Mr. Thompson has been participating in mandatory counseling programs, his probation officer informed me during quarterly updates, but his progress toward understanding the criminal nature of his behavior has been limited. The lack of genuine remorse or behavioral change wasn't surprising, given Dad's lifelong pattern of justifying violence through victim blaming and family loyalty narratives that positioned his assault as appropriate response to my supposed disrespect. Madison's life had undergone complete transformation as she faced the social and financial consequences of her role in encouraging and celebrating family violence against her own sister. Her employment opportunities were limited by background checks that revealed her civil liability for domestic violence, while her social relationships were damaged by community knowledge of her manipulation tactics and victim-blaming attitudes. Madison has been working minimum wage jobs and living in a studio apartment since her father's conviction, mutual acquaintances reported. She's struggling financially and socially because of her association with the domestic violence case. The consequences were appropriate and educational, forcing Madison to experience accountability for behavior that had previously been rewarded with Dad's violent protection and enforcement of her demands. Her attempts at reconciliation with me were sporadic and usually coincided with financial difficulties that made family support appealing, but they consistently included victim blaming and minimization rather than genuine acknowledgement of her role in systematic family abuse. Amber, I know Dad went too far with the physical stuff, but you have to understand that you were being really difficult about the parking situation, Madison said during one supervised phone call arranged through victim services. The continued characterization of criminal assault as going too far, rather than acknowledging it as inexcusable violence, revealed that Madison still didn't understand the difference between family disagreements and domestic abuse. My response to reconciliation attempts was consistent with the boundaries I'd established through legal proceedings and domestic violence counseling. Madison, I'm open to rebuilding our relationship when you can acknowledge that Dad's violence was criminal behavior that you encouraged and celebrated, I replied firmly. Until then, I need to protect myself from people who think family relationships excuse abuse. Extended family relationships had stabilized around acknowledgement that Dad's violence had been unacceptable and that my legal response had been necessary for protection and community education. Uncle Steve had become one of my strongest supporters, regularly attending my advocacy presentations and expressing pride in my courage to prosecute family violence rather than accepting it as normal relationship dynamics. Amber has shown incredible strength in standing up to family abuse and helping other victims understand their legal options, Uncle Steve told community groups. Her case has educated our entire family about recognizing and responding to domestic violence. The family support was meaningful and helped counterbalance the relationships that had been permanently severed by legal proceedings and criminal convictions. My career in victim advocacy had expanded beyond individual case assistance to include policy development and legislative testimony about domestic violence laws and family court procedures. Ms. Thompson's expertise comes from personal experience with family violence and successful legal advocacy, legislators noted when I testified about proposed domestic violence legislation. Her insights help lawmakers understand the victim perspective and the importance of criminal prosecution. The professional opportunities that had grown from personal trauma were deeply fulfilling and allowed me to transform suffering into community education and legal reform that would protect other victims from family members who used violence as control mechanisms. But the most significant development was my relationship with David, a fellow domestic violence survivor who'd attended one of my advocacy presentations and approached me afterward to share his own story of family abuse and legal recovery. Amber, your presentation about prosecuting family violence gave me courage to press charges against my brother who'd been physically abusing me for years, David explained during our first conversation. Hearing how you survived family assault and built a new life showed me that legal action was possible even against relatives. Our relationship had developed naturally through shared experiences with family abuse, legal advocacy, and the healing process that followed criminal prosecution of violent relatives. What I love about you is your strength in choosing legal protection over family accommodation when those values conflicted, David told me during our engagement celebration. You demonstrated exactly the kind of courage and integrity I want in a life partner. David's understanding of domestic violence trauma and his respect for my advocacy work created the foundation for partnership based on mutual support and shared commitment to helping other abuse survivors. Our wedding, planned for the following spring, would be a celebration of healing and new beginnings with guests who included fellow advocates, legal professionals, and family members who'd learned to recognize and oppose domestic violence rather than enabling it. The prenuptial agreement we'd drafted included specific provisions for protecting our advocacy foundation and ensuring that neither of our abusive family members could access our combined resources or interfere with our victim assistance work. As I reviewed applications from domestic violence survivors seeking assistance with legal proceedings and safety planning, I reflected on the journey from assault victim to advocacy leader that had transformed personal trauma into community education and victim support. The security footage of Dad dragging me across concrete and kicking me into garbage cans had become powerful educational material that helped other victims recognize abuse and understand legal options for protection from violent family members. Have you ever had to choose between accepting family violence and prosecuting people who claim to love you? When you realized that their discipline was actually criminal abuse that required legal intervention rather than family mediation? Share your experiences with domestic violence and legal advocacy in the comments below, because your courage to seek justice might inspire someone else who's being abused by people who mistake violence for acceptable family conflict resolution. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life domestic violence survival and legal justice stories. Share this video with anyone who needs to hear that family relationships don't excuse criminal behavior, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is prosecute relatives who use violence as control mechanisms. Thank you for joining me on this journey from family violence to legal victory and victim advocacy, for supporting my decision to choose safety over family loyalty, and for understanding that healthy relationships require mutual respect rather than fear and intimidation through physical force. Remember, you don't owe anyone acceptance of violent behavior just because they are related to you, and you're not obligated to maintain relationships with people who think assault is appropriate conflict resolution. You deserve family members who resolve disagreements through conversation rather than criminal violence. The sweetest justice isn't revenge or retaliation. The sweetest justice is building a life so safe and fulfilling that people who tried to control you through violence can only watch from prison cells as you thrive with partners who actually respect and protect you. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to accept abuse as normal family behavior and choose legal protection over family accommodation when those values conflict fundamentally.